In today's video, I talked to the returning Marc Crawley. He was a guest in Series 4, which took place in 2023. We catch up on what has happened since we last spoke, what has changed, the progression of Diversita, and what employers could be doing to support neurodiversity. Hi guys, and welcome to episode 5 of the Autism Connections, and as you can tell by the intro guys, we are welcoming back Marc Crawley. So Marc, thank you for coming back on to the Autism Connections. I'm getting a guest from each series to come back on. So we're celebrating 5 years and it's series 6. It's hard to believe it all started during the pandemic, and obviously you was on, I believe it was season 4 of the Autism Connections, so about 2 years ago. So I asked you at the time what your connection to autism was then, but my question will be starting from the top will be, from when we last spoke in terms of neurodiversity and autism and even yourself, what has changed since then?
Wow. I mean, I can't believe it was nearly 2 years ago. And congratulations on the 5 years as well. That's incredible. We were Diversita were 3 years old the other day as well. It seems like a month of anniversaries and bits. In terms of the way of what's changed on our side, the core focus for us, and I suppose the core reason for Diversita existing and me working within the neurodiversity space is still the same, right? It's inspired by personal circumstances. And just a reminder, my son is autistic. He was 18 fairly recently, and he was diagnosed when he was 3. I'm also a very early stage of an ADHD diagnosis myself. And so these and other family members form the sort of cornerstone of what we do, right? It's very much that's the driving force and the passion and the purpose. But that runs now, I would say, a lot more in parallel with what we've learned about the neurodiversity community and how we can best help. And when we look at things like employment statistics and day-to-day assistance that our community need, that all forms part of our reason for existing at Diversita. We shaped a little bit more, as in we're probably closer to a neurodiversity consultancy now than maybe a traditional recruitment agency. We still help and advise our job seekers and neurodivergent employees, but we also feel a massive sense of responsibility to educate organizations and businesses around neuro inclusion and making sure they really embrace neurodivergent job seekers and talent, particularly autistic individuals. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. It's still the same, but it's developing all the time. Our reason for being in this community.
No, that's a really good answer. And do you feel a lot of employers are sort of getting on board with that now, or do you find that they are still, I don't know, it's very hard I've always found employers will still believe in some stigmas or some stereotypes, or it's going to cost them a lot of money in order to support autistic or neurodiverse individuals. Do you still feel that's a barrier to entry, or do you think that's got better since we last spoke because of organisations like yourself? And is there other organisations like yourself out there?
So there are other organisations that focus particularly on training and awareness for organisations to try and make sure they understand the value and the importance of neuro inclusion. To answer the first part of your question around organizations and where I see them in a moment, it's certainly not that there's not one answer to cover all of that, right? So we see I would say most of the organizations that we work with are quite well meaning, but relatively early on in their journey around this, right? So, for example, we might work with a big company, but it's usually someone who works in a senior level that's got a neurodivergent child that drives the initiative, or someone in HR or EDI or DEI focusing around this.
Sort of personal link, isn't it, that often makes people go, right, need to do something.
Absolutely, mate. Absolutely. And I think at that point, it's more around raising awareness, right? And there's always going to be a difference between awareness and action, right, in our space. But awareness is a great starting point, and I'd still say a lot of the organisation we're working with are in that camp. Um, what I'm finding interesting though is there are some organisations that show different reasons for wanting to be neuro inclusive. Some of them feel it's a good thing to do from a social perspective, and sometimes that comes across a little bit ableist and patronizing. Others are a little bit too fixated on things like savant skills, right? And the type of skills that you maybe see sometimes misrepresented in media, etc. So it's trying to find a balance. And what we try to do is work with organizations that want to progress naturally, and understand that potentially 20% of their employees are neurodivergent and a large percentage are probably autistic, and trying to create really, really great platforms for individuals to succeed in companies. And that's where we hope it starts to move towards a little bit. But it's mixed, mate. It's mixed. And of course, there's some companies who've got no interest right at the moment, right? And I think they're the ones that hopefully will show a lot of progress over the next couple of years.
I think you're right, and I've gone through the sort of stages of finding jobs, and I remember being told in one of my job interviews once I disclosed I was autistic, that I would have to be sort of responsible for sort of creating my own coping mechanisms.
Oh,
And I don't know, I often give a lot of neurodiverse individuals and autistic individuals the advice of, I used to go into job interviews thinking, how can I be that person for them? How can I mold myself so I can be hired? And I think it's so important that neurodiverse individuals and autistic individuals also go in to a job interview, well, and anyone, to be quite honest, go in with the approach, okay, but is this company right for me? We do that with everything else in our lives. When we buy a house, is the house right for me? When we buy a car, is the car right for me? You don't go in thinking, am I right for the car? Am I right for the house? So I think there's a lot of changing our mindset, because a lot of people are because the statistic is so low for autistic people in work. Um, Once they get that offer, you can see a lot of people jump at the chance because they probably feel like they're not going to get recruited somewhere else, or So I think that's really important, though, that I'd rather be out of a job personally and finally find somewhere that was going to really support me and help me, rather than go somewhere where that turned out not to be true, because I actually think that can be more harmful. And it does lead me to a question, because I'm rambling on like I normally do. Um, are you sort of very good at spotting that when it comes to organisations? And have you had those experience with, neurodiverse individuals when they've actually gone somewhere and it's turned out actually they've not really treated that person or supported them correctly?
without doubt. So the first part of your question around do we see it with organizations trying to make sure that they give a really positive experience to neurodivergent job seekers and applicants? This is what we ask of companies, right? So for example, when we talk to a team that focuses on recruitment, we'll always be saying to them, look, it's not about hiring someone that's autistic just because they're autistic, right? You're hiring someone because they have some great skills for the role you're looking for. And what you're trying to do is create a really fair, equitable interview process where someone has a really enjoyable and challenging experience, and challenging in the right way experience, where they can demonstrate their skills. Now, fundamentally, someone doesn't have the skills to do that job. That's absolutely fine, as long as you've given someone a fair crack at the whip there to try and showcase those skills. And we have a lot of job seekers that come to us afterwards and say, look, I didn't get the job at this place, but it was great. I really enjoyed the interview experience. They gave me some really good reasons as to why they didn't hire me. And I left with a really positive outlook at that organization. The polar opposite is when you have organizations that maybe sometimes have a reasonably good interview process, but then there's a disconnect when they go into the job on a day-to-day basis, the day-to-day support they're getting, all of these other things, and very, very quickly people leave. And sometimes you see on CVs, particularly for autistic job seekers, there's often a few roles, right, with quite short durations. And I've yet to see a situation where I would put any of the blame on the autistic employee. It's always the environments that are wrong. It's always the lack of support. It's always the lack of understanding. It's always the lack of policy. It really genuinely is. And this statistic of 71% of autistic individuals being unemployed, it's no accident, right? And it's not down to one factor. It's a combination of things. And that includes day-to-day leadership and day-to-day onboarding of neurodivergent and autistic employees, which I think is still a big issue. But so I'm rambling now, but I think these different pillars within these processes are really important, that everything's joined up. Great interview process, great onboarding process, great support process afterwards. And if you can start to get those things, then you'll start to again see the skills that you've hired someone for.
I think you're dead right. And what's been so I've just left an organisation where near the end it wasn't so nice, but the manager that I had there, the network manager, it was so nice to work with someone that was so willing and so understanding and so patient to actually get to know Max. And that included the conditions. There were times when I was doing things and he, just maybe a little bit overkill on the admin, or maybe a little in his eyes, maybe a bit like, oh God, why are you going to that level of detail? Or why are you drilling down to that? Or why are you so firm on some of the things that you see that need to happen, like a process or a new starters process. If someone comes to the door and they say, oh, I need so and so set up, why can't Max just do that? And he was probably the only person that took the time to really understand Max. And he would end up saying, it's the best thing we've ever done. It's the best thing he's ever done, because everything is so much more process driven. It's so much more in order. And we know basically everything that is out there and how it's working and how it's operating. And we know that because Max has took the time to be Max and do that. So he really saw the reward, even though at times he probably thought, oh my God, Max, why? He really saw the value. And it was so nice during our end of working together. I said to him how much I've learned from him in terms of dealing with politics or being patient or not trying to run before I can walk, all these sort of life skills, but also the technical side of the job as well. I've learned mountains worth of knowledge because of him. But it was so nice to hear at the end how much he'd learnt from me in terms of neurodiversity, working with someone like myself. And it's now a friendship I will treasure forever. But I think there needs to be more people like him to bring out the best in neurodiverse and autistic individuals. And to the point where I found out, the organisation I was working for, they were spending about £4,000 a year on licenses. I drilled down to the details because that's what I'm like. and found out that we should have only been paying £400 a year for licenses.
Wow.
So there's a real cost saving there. And a lot of employers, as we've discussed, will not necessarily hire a neurodiverse individual because they think it's going to cost us too much money. But there you've got your neurodiverse individual that's just saved you £4,000 a year, right? So there is reward to be gained, and I think that's so important to highlight to employers out there.
It is. What I like about that point you've made there is the relationship between you and the person you report directly to, right? So we did a study recently on the experiences of neurodivergent women in the workplace. And one of the number one findings was definitely the importance of that relationship, because what that can mean is two things. First of all, that person, the manager, has the flexibility and autonomy, particularly within good organizations, to be able to create an environment that's sometimes a little bit outside of policy, that's sometimes a little bit outside of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, to be able to support that person, right? And that's so important. And the other thing is that that manager has a responsibility to educate themselves on a day-to-day basis. And what I like, again, what you said there was about there's a bit of self-advocacy there, Max, as well, because you obviously you're educating them, you're advocating for yourself, and there is still a real opportunity for neurodivergent individuals, given the right platform, to do that on a day-to-day basis, to educate people around them. But it needs that manager and it needs that organization to show an interest and to the very least meet them halfway on that. And if you can do that, and of course you're going to see benefits going forward, right? And it's not unusual for us to talk to neurodivergent employees that don't necessarily like the company they work for, but they love the manager they work for. And so that's a real opportunity for people, leaders, and managers to make a difference on a day-to-day basis.
And so what has sort of made you go down the diagnosis route for yourself? Because you mentioned you're in the progress of getting diagnosed with ADHD. Have you had sort of challenging circumstances in the workplace, and has that sort of led you to wanting to get a diagnosis, or is it something completely different? Is it people just sort of going, "Oh, Mark, you do this, by the way. Mark, you do that." Um, what's it for you?
It's a fair point. And talking honestly, it's the first time I've probably spoken about it too much. So I think for me, I've always felt that my mind works in a particular way, right? And even prior to setting up Diversita or really being focused around neurodiversity or even having an autistic son, it was one of those, and a lot of people that are neurodivergent, I suppose, say this. It's like, well, I thought everyone thought that way, right? Or I thought everyone saw the things this way. And for me, it was a lot of ideas, overwhelm, sometimes anxiety, but I mitigated against that by trying to control my environment and all this other stuff, right? That you see from individuals that are neurodivergent, particularly ADHD. But as I started working in this space, it became even more prevalent, right? And I think what really resonated and really hit home for me was then, well, I'm working for myself now. Let's start working and really thinking about the working pattern that works best for me, right? So, for example, I tend to work from about 5 in the morning till about 2 in the afternoon. And then talking honestly, mate, I fall asleep, right? I burn out for about an hour and a half and then reset again. And I started thinking, well, I couldn't have done that in a corporate environment. I mean, within an office in the middle of Cheapside. But I can do it here now. And then I started looking at other things, like the way I organize myself, the amount of ideas I have that sometimes overwhelmed with those ideas, trying to channel things. And so there was a few challenges around that as well. But for me, there's just so many positives around it that journey is becoming quite important. Now, in terms of the diagnosis, for me, mate, it's not as important to me because I work in this space. So I know the way my mind works and I know how I identify. But I am on a very, very long NHS waiting list because it's not worth me going private because it's not something that's massively important to me. However, obviously it's really important to a lot of other people, and I understand why, right? Particularly when it comes to medication and stuff like that. So for me, it's been more around just learning day to day as I get a bit older, the way my mind works. And naturally you then look backwards, right? You start looking at some of the things you might have done at school or some of the ways that you worked in the past, etc. but yeah, it's a bit of a journey for me. But what it does do is it lets me resonate with the audience a lot more, right? And lets me talk particularly around ADHD from a personal perspective, and I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely. It's about that sort of I've always sort of said it's that self-acceptance, and you may know deep down that you've got the condition, but it's different knowing yourself versus it. I don't know, it's odd being official, right? It's like I don't know, it's a bit like getting married, I suppose, isn't it? You know that you love each other and you know that you want to spend the rest of your lives together, but having it on paper, something about it being official gives you that self-acceptance and that I don't know, that bindingness that some people need. And also, it does give you the access that you need if you need to get the support, right? Because if you've not got that, um, unfortunately, I don't know why, but we live in a society where it's not good enough to say I'm suffering and I need help and I need this. We sort of live in a society. It's like, okay, Mark, you're suffering, but unfortunately, you need to go on a 4-year waiting list in order for you to get the help that you need. That might not be your case. Don't think it is, but for some people, and I think it's atrocious, really. That we live in that society where it's like, we understand your issues and your the events that you're going through in life, but can you wait 4 years? Is a little bit, you know, really. So, um, but again, that's probably another issue for another day. I mean, do you deal a lot as well with does Diversita and yourself work a lot with government and trying to change policy and things like access to work? Because I've spoken to a number of autistic, neurodiverse individuals, and sometimes I've gone through the access to work scheme as well. And unfortunately, by the time they got in and needed to do what they needed, I was already gone because the situation for me just wasn't sort of tenable. It was a job where I was told I can't wear headphones, even though I sort of argued the point it would make me concentrate and make me work better. For her to look around, for me to look around the room and go, well, Frank's wearing headphones. Oh, well, Frank's been here 10 years and you're still in probation.
What's that about? That's
Which was, do you work a lot with government, or is that something that you can see going forward in terms of policy and in terms of access to work? Is that something that you feel needs to be quicker and improved?
I mean, in terms of working with local authorities or government, we're starting to. So I live in Bromley, and I've met with the local authority there, including the job centres, including the council. And there's a few things that have stood out, and I'm sure they are replicated across most local authorities, right? Is that job centres, for example, are incredibly stretched anyway. And then trying to ask the job centres to give tailored advice to a neurodivergent job seeker around reasonable adjustments or how to self-advocate is almost impossible, right? So that's one key challenge straight away. The other thing I've noticed is I suppose the lack of sort of institutional support for neurodivergent job seekers, and trying to look at how they can move that forward. So, however, there is something that's very, very new that seems to have is getting a little bit of momentum called Connect to Work, and it was brought in by the Labour government, and it looks like there's a big initiative to try and get more neurodivergent and disabled individuals back into work. Now, unfortunately, it was launched alongside the potential PIP cuts, right? So it's not. It looks like a bit of a sort of a hand in hand situation there. Like, we're going to cut PIP, but we're going to try and help you get back into work. And because of that, it's getting a little bit of a negative press. But it could be a good initiative. It could, if it's funded right. going on to access to work in particular. So we've dipped our toe into this a little bit by making sure that we've helped some of our neurodivergent community get access to work applications in, and we use a consultant to help do that, and we don't charge the individual, and we've made sure that people know and can navigate their way around that process. But mate, the biggest challenge with that is the name itself, right? It's not about getting into work. It's about when you're in work, getting some additional support, which is very important, admittedly. But even I've noticed, and I did an interview with someone at the BBC on this last week. Is that even that process is changing, right? I did my own application and I was outsourced to someone who obviously did like almost like an occupational health check. And it was rubbish, mate. I'm not going to lie. Sorry, I'm being a bit flippant there. It was awful. It really was, right? And nothing that was discussed, I never felt like I was being listened to. None of the stuff that was discussed seemed like generic. There was a real drive to try and use certain providers. It was really, really poor experience. And I did a webinar on it recently. So access to work needs a lot of work, but I can understand it's quite overwhelmed. My biggest challenge at the moment, mate, I think, is the lack of clear support for neurodivergent job seekers, right, to try and get some help. And that's where we're trying to help at the moment, right? We've got a new digital platform where people can come and get very tailored advice about identifying neuro-inclusive companies and a lot of other great advice. And it's sorely needed, right? So that to me is a bigger obstacle than some of the challenges around access to work, but that is a challenge as well.
I think you're spot on. Yeah, there's sort of twofold, isn't it? And I always say if you can't get it right from the ground up, then it's going to slowly but surely come tumbling down. You know, we've got children who are neurodiverse going into school, but 50% of autistic individuals are excluded from school. So you're getting it wrong there.
Yeah.
They then haven't got the qualifications or degrees to go to college, to get the expertise that they need to go into work. So you're failing there. The educational system, I think, needs a revamp anyway, because a lot of kids leave school knowing how many wives Henry VIII have, but don't know how to write a resume or read a bank statement. So you're getting that bit wrong. And then you get to the point where the employer will look at a neurodiverse individual, won't want to hire them because they've got their own stereotypes and stigmas. So there's so many roadblocks. And then finally, as you say, once you're in the work, it's then getting the support that you may need in order to do the work. So it's an absolute big issue that needs to be, I think, looked at a lot more. So it does lead me on to my last question, which would be, if we was to do a interviewing realistically, it'd probably be when we're celebrating 10 years of the Autism Connections and we're having a guest back on from every series. What would you have hoped that has changed in the next 5 years for neurodiversity, but also Diversita? What would you have hoped that's been accomplished and that has changed for the good in that time?
So I read a stat the other day from the Tech Talent Charter report, which was last year. Where I think they surveyed 2,000 companies and 20,000 20,000 technologists. And one of the most striking stats was that companies on that survey believed that only 3% of their workforce was neurodivergent. Right. So, and you probably know as well as I do, based around the most recent statistics, it's around 17 to 20%, right, of the global population neurodivergent. And what made me chuckle a little bit in this instance was this was a focus on tech as well, right, where there's probably closer to around 30 to 35% of the of employees are neurodivergent. So I would like in 5 years' time companies to have a much better understanding about their own neurodivergent community within their organizations. Because what that does then is it creates a couple of things. First of all, it creates an awareness and understanding, and where you can really start to drive some action to make sure people become they can demonstrate their skill set in a far more open, understanding environment. But the second key thing, and this is where our future is obviously a little bit different, is that at Diversa, is that there's a concept called universal design where you don't need to disclose, right? Within organizations, you're accepted if you think slightly differently, you're accepted if you have slightly different beliefs, you're accepted if you work in a slightly different way. And there's always going to be a little bit of a challenging period around getting this ingrained in organizations. But if organizations can look at that as the journey, right, look at that as like this is something we want to change all the time, and get to this place where it doesn't matter what your neurotype is, right? It means you can go in and be accepted in organizations. That's where I'd like us to be made a bit more progress for in the next 5 years. Because there's no doubt that it's sometimes hard for people to disclose, right? You know what I mean? You don't need necessarily to disclose your sexuality. You don't need to disclose what school, sorry, what sort of socioeconomic background you had. You don't need to disclose a lot of these things. But we are asking people to disclose their neurodivergence, right, or neurotype, to try and get support. And I think that's where we are at the moment, and I understand that, right? And it's important that we accept the situation as it is at the moment and work with it. But it's also important we try to change it, right? And I think if in 5 years' time we can get to a point where it's a case of, right, here we go, right? We are moving towards this. That's I think is a really exciting period for me. So yeah, and hopefully my hair's not got any grayer in 5 years, mate, as well. So I'd be interested to see if I want an interview in 5 years' time, the way I look as well.
Hey, hopefully I've got hair.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true. That's a good starting point, regardless of colour. It's true.
Well, I just want to say thank you for coming back on, Mark. It's always so nice to talk, and yeah, you just got so much knowledge and insight, and I just think what you guys do is so great. So, thank you for coming back on, and yeah, just thank you for your time.
No, mate, and listen, thank you for you. You do some great work, you really do, and you were obviously kind enough to share some time on one of our community meetups earlier, and it was great to see so many people who resonate with you, resonate with your message, and know about the sort of work you do. So no, thank you to you as well, mate. It's always a pleasure talking to you.